Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Adult and Pediatric Institute podcast. This is a podcast where we get messy, we get real, and we talk about some real life things. So, today on our podcast, we have someone that I'm really excited to talk to. This is someone that is kind of changing the game. She is an attorney, she is an advocate, she is a social media personality, we'll say. And she's just an amazing overall person that's really breaking barriers. And it is Haley Moss. So, Haley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy that we're able to do this and we're able to chat. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to feel very inspired by you and what you've been able to accomplish. So, to get started, tell us a little bit about you.
Where do you want me to start?
Ah,
I
you
feel
know,
like
tell
asking an autistic person to tell them about themselves is like the most vague, ambiguous question you could
Oh my
possibly
gosh,
ask.
I love that. I think that that is the best way to start right there. So you have autism,
Mhm.
and if you had to write a quick bio about you of parts of your identity, what would some of those parts of your identity be? One being an attorney. What else?
I would tell you that I am autistic, obviously. I would tell you that I am an attorney by trade, but an educator by choice because I genuinely enjoy getting to help people understand disability, neurodiversity, and autism and related concepts and conditions and identities. I think that's something that's really impactful in my life and the lives of others. I think it helped me make more of a difference than being in active law practice did. I am grateful for my time practicing law, but I feel like I can make an impact every day right now, and that feels a lot more inspiring and gives me more of a sense of purpose, I suppose you can say.
Yeah.
I'm also an author, I am an illustrator. I hope that at the end of the day, no matter what I've done professionally, I do like to be a person. I think so often when it comes to identity topics, we get very wrapped up in that's somebody's entire personality.
Hmm.
So I try to make it very clear autism is not my personality, that outside of my profession and parts of my identity, I am kind of a little bit of a nerd. I say that very lovingly. I love the things that I love very intensely. I am passionate about video games. I love collecting Pokemon cards. I am a huge Swiftie. And I really just love getting to explore all of my different interests, whatever they may be and wherever they lead me. And honestly, I just want to have fun and have a lot of the same goals as most people my age, which is not that exciting. But I think when we talk about disability, people find it very exciting because they think that we live very different lives and we have more in common than not.
Yeah, and they really don't understand it in my experience. Both of my daughters have autism, and autism does not define them, but a lot of their characteristics and their personality strengths are, I think, are because of their autism, not in spite of it.
Exactly. I don't feel like autism defines me, but I don't know what it is like to be neurotypical, and I have no desire to know. So, kind of the way that I look at it is it's almost like a lens of which and a filter in which I see the world, and I can't take it off. This is just what I know. I don't know any different. I don't want to know any different, and I probably never will. So I have that sort of healthy acceptance.
That acceptance, I think, is really something that people struggle with the most. I know
Mhm.
clients that we see, and this is, I'm just going to kind of go off here. So, this is another reason why I'm so excited to have you on
Mhm.
this podcast because obviously the lens that I see this through is as a neurotypical individual without autism.
Mhm.
I also see autism through the lens of being a parent of two kids with autism, but my viewpoints are going to be completely different than your viewpoints. And I think it's really important that you get that voice. Your voice is going to
Mhm.
positively impact my kids more than my voice ever will because you've lived this life.
I have so much respect for that take, and at the same time, I do think there's room in the autism conversation for all sorts of voices, and I do think parent voices are extremely important. It's just like you've said for so long, I think parent voices got most of the spotlight. So
Yeah.
having self-advocates being able to share their lived experience and stories are really powerful, but I don't think it means that parents are less valuable or anything of that nature. We just have to have a bigger table that actually makes room for everybody to share their life and their perspective. I
Yes.
am not a parent. I also don't have the same level of support needs that other adults and children do. I'm very verbal. I am able to live independently. I am able to do a lot of things. There are things that are very hard for me, and there are things that I am able to just do like everybody else. So, really understanding how diverse that spectrum is something I think that gets lost in the nuance and it becomes an us against them, and it really doesn't need to be that way.
Ugh, I agree. Thank you for saying that. Yes. And I think that our need for labels to better
Mhm,
understand people, we need words, right?
mhm,
If you can give people words and if you can apply words to a really complex social characteristic, human characteristic, then other people that haven't lived with that experience, they can better understand it. But then we get really caught up in words and we get really caught up in labels.
we
And
really
it's
do.
and it's hard because ultimately it is such a big spectrum. And so, how can you explain a feeling or an individual characteristic without using words? You kind of can't, but then
Mhm,
you also can't really fit the right words to it so that everyone understands without boxing yourself in. And so, yeah, I totally agree
mhm,
that there's room at the table for everyone and of varying levels of the spectrum and
mhm,
varying positions within the world of autism, parents, self advocates, adults,
mhm.
people with profound autism, they have a voice as well. It may not always be verbal, but they should absolutely have a seat at that table so that people can get a more well rounded view of what autism is.
Exactly, and especially those who have more day-to-day needs than I do, and like you say, profound autism, I always just say people who have different needs of support, or I try to explain, like, what they need, like, maybe they aren't speaking, or maybe they also have an intellectual disability,
Hmm.
that those folks have stuff to share. They have a very valid perspective, they might need assistance to get that out, but so often they're overlooked or overshadowed. One
Yeah.
of my biggest kind of gripes in autism politics, I know this wasn't what we expected to be talking about, is that if you are someone who historically was deemed high functioning, you were looked at as you didn't need any support and that you were somehow taking it away from others. And if you were deemed lower functioning, quote unquote, I really don't like these terms, which you could probably tell,
Yeah,
that
I don't think
you're
anyone that's intimately involved with the autism world likes those
oh
terms,
no.
but we recognize that's part of that. You've gotta kinda put words for
Mhm.
so that lay people
Yeah.
can better understand.
Yeah, and my issue with when that happens is if you're, like, described as lower functioning, people just write off whatever potential or ability you do have. Like
Yes.
like, nobody wins here that I will have people deny accommodations thinking, "Oh, you're not disabled enough," and if you are someone who is deemed too disabled, they don't even wanna give you a chance.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh. Yeah, that's
So
so
messy, I
gross.
can never
How do we
really
fix this?
that I feel like in neurotypical world, you're never going to be squarely in the middle enough that it's, like, acceptable sometimes, and it's really complicated, especially when you start throwing in different social dynamics and things like masking and camouflaging different traits and really trying to assimilate into neurotypical culture even more. Because
Yeah.
then it's like, "Oh, you know what you're doing. You're like neurotypical light. You're somebody's manic pixie dream girl." And you're like, "No, I actually need help with stuff."
Obviously, I use a lot of my own kids' lived experiences when I'm trying to talk with clients. I had a client that asked me the other day, um, "So how autistic is my kid?" And I don't think that that's a bad question to ask. I think
Mhm,
it's a question that most parents, when they get that diagnosis, that's
mhm,
kind of what they're thinking in their head. So, how autistic are they?
mhm,
But a lot of the times they're too afraid to ask that question. And
mhm,
if you don't ask these questions, you are never opening up the door
mhm.
to clear up misconceptions.
Absolutely. I think questions are always a good thing, and you don't have to have the right vocabulary to ask questions or be understanding.
Most people don't, right?
People get
Let's get politically incorrect. Let's
people get
talk
so
about
bogged down in the language.
terminology.
I would rather you get the language wrong and your actions are accepting and kind and caring than you
Mhm.
say all the right things and it's basically just a pig in a ball gown.
Yep. Absolutely. My response when parents ask this or similar questions, or they want to talk about levels, or they want to talk
Mhm.
about high functioning versus low functioning,
Mhm.
the way that I explained it, and I would love either correction on my explanation from you or validation. The
Okay.
way that I explain it is it's a spectrum. And when we get too caught up in high functioning or low functioning, we're not telling the whole picture of this individual.
Mm.
So you really have to break it down by their domain. So I could tell you my daughters, certain domains, they would be considered very high functioning. They are verbal. They can advocate for their needs. They can perform their ADLs. That would be considered high functioning. But then when you
Mhm.
talk about their interpretation of social norms,
Yep.
and how that impacts their life, they would be very low functioning because they really struggle with that. And their lack of understanding social norms and social cues from their peers has led to suicidal ideations. It
Mhm.
has led to self harming behaviors.
Mm.
In my eyes, as a psychiatric nurse, to me, that's seriously impactful. That leads to loss of life. So if you just looked at my kids and you kind of said, humana, humana, you're high functioning, you're missing
Mhm.
such a big part of their autism that does need support and it does need resources because
Mhm.
without that, there's a risk of life.
I think you're on the right path 100% here. And the way that I always like to describe functioning when people try to pull that on me is that functioning is very dynamic. That, like you just did with your daughters, I can paint you two very different pictures of my day to day life and ask you which one is high functioning and which one is low functioning. And you'll very clearly be able to name that and completely disregard that they're the same person.
Yeah.
I can tell
And it
you.
changes.
Exactly. Like, I know there are days that I do not have the same capacity, whether I'm tired or I didn't eat enough or I am overwhelmed from something else because my sensory system gets very overwhelmed very easily.
Hmm.
That I like, think of how often, even just as human beings, we get dysregulated. How many of us have snapped at somebody we care about because we were hungry?
Oh, 100%. I tell my kids all the time, I'm overstimulated right now, and I need you to be respectful of my needs. I need you guys to give me 15 minutes of uninterrupted time.
And that is setting a great example on how to self-advocate, and I always try to tell that, like, that's awesome that you're doing that and showing how boundaries and self-advocacy works, and even just having that awareness because when we are overstimulated, I know this from personal experience too, that we just don't act like ourselves, we don't do
Yeah.
things that are in character. I know even in some of my best relationships and friendships, that the biggest source of tension and conflict was when both people were overstimulated. Or because you're so used to trying to help one person regulate that you don't know how to do it for yourself and them at the same time.
That's something that they're going to need to use in the workforce. And there's nothing
Exactly.
wrong with that.
And not even just the workforce, but something I've learned very recently in my adult life is I know when I feel very overwhelmed and I'm immediately supposed to have a response to something or something that someone is saying, I'm like, I hear you, but I really just need about 10 minutes to really think because I don't want to just say something impulsive or rude or hurtful. Like, I really want to make space for what you're thinking and feeling and saying. But I also
Mhm.
can't be there if I am too overwhelmed to function.
I love that insight, Haley.
Take a break from a situation, especially conflict-based situations, I've learned, if you just
Yeah.
say, "I need a couple of minutes, can we come back to this?"
Yeah.
Usually and then it also helps the other person have a couple minutes to regulate too instead of just passionate exchange of feelings, words, whatever.
Without
It
processing.
Yeah, I feel like that's something a lot of us don't learn until later in adulthood. I do think especially for autistics, there is kind of this inherent people-pleasing instinct that happens because we are so used to trying to assimilate to neurotypical norms and expectations.
Yeah.
That learning that it's okay to actually advocate for your needs no matter what the situation,
Yeah, and
and
I think
really
that that
even
can
ask
apply
you.
to neurotypical as well.
Yeah,
That's not just autistic individuals. That's
yeah,
also neurotypical people
mhm.
need to get better at being able to advocate for their own needs
Oh, for sure.
and not people please.
I do think the way that it happens, though, to autistics is a very nuanced conversation
Yes.
on the masking and social expectations is that everybody else's comfort comes before yours is almost what you're taught, even though that's
Mhm.
never quite the intention. Because you learn these skills, especially if you're like me and you grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. You learn this stuff so you didn't get bullied. You learn this stuff as survival, and that's also what the goals of a lot of therapy and interventions were, was to live as normal of a life as possible, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with the approach entirely, but it does unintentionally reinforce that your needs are secondary.
Yeah. And the consequences
Mhm.
are different for
Yeah.
autistic individuals. If I, as a neurotypical individual, do not advocate for myself in the moment to say, "Hey, I need a minute," I can probably still hang in there and just deal with it. An autistic individual, if they're not advocating for themselves, might lead to snapping at their boss and losing their job because they're only going to be able to
Mhm.
hang in there for so long.
Exactly.
So, going back to your experience and your history with this, you were diagnosed with autism when you were 3 years old.
Yes.
How do you feel like autism kind of shaped your sense of identity growing up? Because you already touched on that of you felt the need to people please and things like that. How else do you feel like autism shaped who you were?
I mean, that's just stuff that I feel like I've discovered more in adulthood of the whole people pleasing thing, because I thought the masking thing was something I'm very cognizant of anyway, because I
Uh-huh.
didn't want to get bullied. And kids can be awfully cruel to each other. And that was one of my
Yes.
goals, was just get through everything. So growing up, I was one of those quiet, shy, sensitive kids that held it all together and then would come home and cry and melt down and all that stuff. And I was the pleasure to have in class, but then had this bundle of anxiety that would get released when I got home.
Okay.
So, I think that was a very typical experience for a lot of autistic girls in particular.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I had a very good childhood, and my parents were very involved. They made sure that I also grew up with a healthy sense of self-esteem, so I did have a lot of confidence actually as a
Good.
young autistic kid, which I feel like is not the norm. And the way that they told me about my autism when I was 9 years old was probably the most neurodiversity affirming thing they could have done even without having that language. So that's why earlier I was saying you don't have to have great vocabulary around disability to be a really strong ally and to really kind of strong arm your kids or whoever you care about to be disability confident and to kind of own that part of themselves. Is that they made me think that I was different and that different was a good thing. At the time I was obsessed with Harry Potter, and they compared my autism to having powers like Harry Potter, and that even though you might not fit in with, like, the neurotypical kids or the muggles, and you don't quite fit in with the wizards or the other group, you're still the hero of the story, and you're still well respected and liked, and we really focused on those strengths. So growing up, I really did feel that I had some kind of magic in me, that this was this really cool thing, but I also didn't quite know how to talk about it with my peers until I was a little bit older. So I talk a lot about disclosure now because it's one of those things that comes up in the workforce and other facets of life, that as a young person, I was very nervous to kind of share that I was autistic with friends and whoever, because I didn't really know how to have those conversations.
Yeah.
So it sounded like a much bigger deal and something I was a lot more insecure about than what reality would actually be.
I'm gonna say I'm sitting on this side of the microphone and I'm trying not to get emotional because a lot of what you just shared with how your parents chose to approach
Mhm.
is a lot of what I've been trying to do with my girls because it's so hard on this side. It is
It
so
is.
hard to see them struggle.
Mhm.
My older one is very self-conscious about her autism. She doesn't want anyone to know. She
Mhm.
has struggled with bullying in the past because you're right, kids are jerks.
Yeah.
Neurotypical kids are jerks to neurotypical kids. Add in an invisible disability,
Mhm.
and it makes it that much worse.
Oh, yeah.
And so just hearing you talk about how that worked for you
Mhm.
gives me hope that my approach, doing very similar, saying, listen, everyone's got something.
It's
Everyone has something. But your autism also gives you something that a neurotypical person will never have. It gives you an ability to problem solve
yeah.
and see certain issues or see art or
Mhm.
see music that a neurotypical person will never see that.
Have it exactly the way I would want that, and I do think when you talk about the my daughter doesn't wanna tell anyone, I felt that way actually for a very long time,
What helped you
and
overcome that?
I was asked to speak at a conference, and I decided to do it because it was in Orlando, and I
Mhm.
wanted to go to Disney World.
There
Even
you
though I
go. Disney is always a great positive reinforcer.
I was 13, and I'd also been raised to always give back, like, I genuinely wanted to go to Disney, though, let's be real, I was 13, going to Disney was a great time. I'm a Floridian, and I've been to Disney 1,000 times, I love the parks, but a free trip to Disney or a trip to Disney that mean I had to do something and then you get to go to the parks, done, sold.
Yeah. Okay.
I didn't realize that actually just sharing my story would make a difference for other people. I was approached about writing a book, which is the wildest thing that could have possibly happened to 13-year-old me because I was on a panel with a bunch of older guys mostly.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I don't really want this to be under my name. I'm happy to do it, but I don't know how I feel about it. And then I'm like, you know what? If I can actually help somebody, then it's worth it. Why not? I did not think it would turn into my life. I didn't think I would just be open with everybody. And I do think that identity really is a journey because even how I've talked about autism throughout my career has changed greatly. That
Yeah.
some writing of mine from when I was a teenager is still very much on the internet. And some of the things that I have said at 16, 18, even up to maybe when I was about 20 or 21 are things that I would not say today.
Yeah.
And I'm
And but
okay with
in
that.
that period of your life,
Mhm.
that's what applied, and how cool is that that you get to kinda see some of those writings
Yeah,
and go back to it and say, "Wow, that's who I was when I was 16. Look at how far I've come now."
exactly. And then
That's
there's
really
things I
cool.
didn't have language for. So even when we talked about masking and camouflaging and how that kind of reinforces people pleasing, I didn't have the language for that. I just knew I didn't want to cause trouble. I was always a good kid. I didn't want to cause any tension or conflict. And I also wanted to be easy for neurotypical people to interact with and work
Yeah.
with. And that subconsciously meant put your needs second.
Yeah.
And now that, and of course, that's something I learned in adulthood with having more language and more knowledge. Like, the more that you think about these things, the more you're like, oh my gosh, I might have known this, but I didn't know this. And there's so
Yeah.
many experiences that shape who we are and help us have these conversations.
Yes. Wow.
Acceptance really is kind of this journey because even as a teenager, I wanted to be one of the neurotypical kids to some extent. Like, I'm like, I
Yeah.
just wish it was easier to make friends. I wish I had friends that I actually wanted to hang out with and who invited me to things and all of this other stuff. Like, I wanted all those things and I didn't really know how to get there. And then the older I get, I'm like, you know what? The friends that I have now are people who are accepting, they're understanding. It should be no surprise that the majority of people that I interact with on a regular basis are also neurodivergent. Like, there's kind of
Yeah.
this understanding, and you do find your people, as cliche as it sounds. So,
Yeah,
my
and that
favorite
makes
people,
sense.
yeah. I say all the time that some of my favorite people are literally ADHDers because I feel like they're me, but they're more outgoing.
Yeah.
They will
Yeah.
get me out of my comfort zone a little bit more.
Yeah. They'll take you kinda under their wing to be like, "Come
Exactly.
on, let's go. Nope, we're going out tonight," or whatever.
And my ADHD friends need their, like, emotional support autistic friend to help ground them.
Oh, I love that.
So it's one of those very nice, like, symbiotic relationships to have. It's the weirdest thing that I say is that ADHDers and autistics are the best happy medium together.
There's a really strong
Yep.
comorbidity with ADHD and autism. With both of them, you're seeing a certain level of impulsive behaviors, you're
Mhm.
seeing stimming like behaviors. So I
Oh,
could
yes.
see why you feel that way because
Mhm.
a lot of what you've experienced and what you have going on, they also do. And so they can
Mhm.
empathize with that.
Mhm. So I have been going through this renaissance for the last couple of years of likely figuring out that I probably do have both.
Hmm.
But at this point in my life, it doesn't make sense to have it formally checked out.
Well, and what are you going to do with that?
Exactly, it's not gonna change my life one way or
Yeah.
another, but I feel like having that kind of self-discovery makes sense of the things that autism alone does not explain.
Yes, absolutely. And it's
So,
very validating.
why am I so routine driven? Why do I need routine? Why can't I follow this? Why am I time blind at the same time? I hyper focus, but then I don't realize what time it is.
Yes.
All sorts of other random things that ADHD would be the only other logical explanation.
A lot of clients that have a dual diagnosis of autism and ADHD, or a lot of the older kids that come to us,
Mhm.
they normally are coming to us with a laundry list of diagnoses by the time
Mhm.
they get to us when we're finally looking, is this actually ASD? And most of the time on that laundry list is ADHD. And so a lot of the parents, they want to know, well, is this the ADHD or is this the autism?
Yeah.
And we have to be honest with them and say, well,
Could be
there's no
both.
way to say. It could be both.
Y
We may never know whether this is
Yeah.
autism or ADHD, but either way, if it's something that's negatively impacting your life, it
Mhm.
still deserves space, it still deserves treatment, it still deserves recognition.
Absolutely. I always come from the place of anything that improves quality of life, I am on board with.
Yep,
I say
exactly.
that about research, I say that about medication, I say that about therapy, I say that about all sorts of different things when it comes to this arena.
Yeah,
That if you can improve quality of life, I have nothing against it.
yep. Then we're here for it, right?
Mhm. And I think that's a very especially in today's climate with autism, I think that is the safest answer I could possibly give. I will always support research that improves quality of life. I
Yeah,
don't think that's a controversial take.
I don't either. And like you said, with the current climate, I think that it's important to acknowledge, look, there's some things that to my opinion is a hard stop. In
Mhm.
my opinion, it's a hard stop to add anyone to a registry without their consent.
Agree.
But there's some good that can come out of registries. There's some great things that can come out of rallying the scientific community to say, hey, we need a better understanding of this. A lot of good can come from that as long as it's done right. And also, I think it's the root of it, right? Where is
Mhm.
this coming from? What's driving this? What's the motivating factor? If the motivating
Mhm.
factor is really just to have a better understanding and to help people,
Mhm.
then okay, cool. Then I'm here for it. If the motivating factor is to fulfill someone's
Yeah.
narrative, and this applies to what we were just talking about with
Mhm.
asking questions.
Yeah.
If you're coming from a place of love and acceptance and a better understanding, then hey, we're here for it. It's okay.
Exactly. Even before this whole registry talk, which I am very much opposed to, I do think that it overshadows the work that a lot of researchers have been doing. So if
Yes.
you follow what goes on in autism research, a lot of them are focused on quality of life, really talking to people with lived experience that there's so many great things that are happening that we don't have to go all the way back to, oh no, what's the root cause out of some kind of fear
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
reopen books that have already been long since closed.
Yes. Speaking of books, I do want to jump. One of the books that you published is Great Minds Think Differently: Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals. And I think that that's a topic I really want to talk to you about, is neurodiversity in the workplace, because that's
Mhm.
something that my kids are young. We're not there yet,
Mhm.
and through my lens, just as a clinician, I do have some insight into that, but you're going to have way more insight. For our listeners, what are some recommendations that you have if you were sitting down with an individual, an adult, and
Mhm.
they were neurodiverse? What are some of your advice pieces that you could
Mhm.
give to this individual to help them better disclose this in the workplace and better advocate for themselves?
My first piece of advice to you is you actually don't have to disclose if you don't want to. I think there's this kind of natural inclination for people to disclose because they think it's the only way they will get support. And then there's this other kind of train of thought of never disclose because you'll never get hired. And I don't think either approach is entirely correct. I think it's very nuanced. I think it's very personal of a decision if you want to disclose and when you choose to. So usually I tell people, and what I would tell this person in front of us is to be strategic, that you know yourself better than anybody else. And when it comes to advocating for yourself, whether it's for accommodations or whatever it may be, you might not have to just flat out disclose. I know that sounds counterintuitive. I usually tell people if you want the legal protections, if you have an HR department, disclosing's in your favor. So then you can make sure you have all of that good stuff. But generally, people are a lot more accepting, so I've learned, if you frame things in a way that doesn't scare them.
Yeah.
And what I do with disclosure, a lot of the times I advocate for this thing known as soft disclosure. So you can kind of hint at having a disability or a struggle, but you don't explicitly say anything. So even when we were talking earlier about being overwhelmed
Mhm.
and that you need 5 minutes, that same type of strategy works professionally. That I, for instance, am a terrible note taker. I will ask if somebody else is taking notes in a meeting and if they can circulate them to everybody who's on the call. Like, that doesn't seem unreasonable. It ends up accommodating me, and usually people are very good about it. Or they'll say, we're recording, we'll send the recording to everybody. Or now with AI being AI, somebody will have an AI chatbot that's taking notes for us anyway. So we don't have to worry about who is responsible. And it ends up benefiting everyone.
I love
So
that.
I have moments where I don't disclose at all unless I absolutely have to. And I
Okay.
also fear with disclosure interviewings where things get weird because when people disclose in interviews, their interviewer doesn't always know their rights or the person's rights and will go off the rails really quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have sat in interviews where I have disclosed because it was relevant to my resume.
Mhm.
Because they always ask, okay, great, you were a lawyer, you practiced for X amount of time, but you left and you did something else. Like, why did you do this? Or why did you write a book about autism? Like, people will ask those questions. It's a very relevant question to ask.
Mhm.
I can't really, make up a good story.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a secret if you've looked up my name, which you bet an interviewer has done. But when I do disclose, that's when things can go off the rails very quickly, like, where they start asking and questioning your competence or and you are sitting there thinking this is a huge red flag, but you're in a situation where there's an uneven power dynamic and you can't really do too much about it.
Mhm.
So you have to be prepared to advocate for yourself in a way that is strategic. So whether that's really blowing up your strengths and saying how great you are, or minimizing their perceived deficits, you are kind of doing overtime when you choose to disclose and it goes off the rails because you can't immediately go, hey, that's not something that is ADA compliant or might be a potential EEOC issue.
Yeah. I concur with everything that you said that a lot of the times the person interviewing you, that's not
Mhm.
someone from HR that's interviewing you. That's probably going to be your immediate supervisor.
Mhm.
Most of them have no idea what they are or are not allowed to ask, i.e., if someone discloses that they have a disability, by law, they do not have to tell you what that disability is, nor
No.
are you allowed to ask them.
The only thing you can actually ask them is can they do the job with or
Yes.
without an accommodation?
Yes. And
And even if it's an obvious disability and you notice that obvious disability and it seems to be in line or out of line with some expectation or responsibility in the role, you can ask them how they expect to do it. Like, that's totally fine. I
absolutely.
usually, when I teach HR compliance, I say the obvious example is you have someone who's deaf who's interviewing to be a receptionist, and you can actually ask them how they plan on answering the phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, that's a legitimate question, and they might say, "I need an accommodation to use text-to-speech software or
Yep.
speech to text, or I use TTY services." Like, that's valid.
Yeah.
Asking, "Oh, did you lose your hearing at birth, or were you born this way, or did you become deaf?" Like, that's not the what you can ask them. You can
Yeah.
ask them, like, "Can you do this?
Nor
How
should
do
you
you do
ask
this?"
them that because that has
People
nothing to
ask
do with the job.
but people ask the most ridiculous stuff. I have sat in job interviews where I was explaining my existence.
Oh gosh. Yeah. That should have
And
never happened.
of course, I felt defeated. That wasn't what I was here for. I wanted to tell this person why I'd be a great litigator.
Yeah. The other day, too, a client asked me when you're applying for a job and it asks, do you have a disability? If you say no, so that they will interview you, are you allowed after the fact, maybe after you get the job, to then go to HR and say, I do better with certain accommodations related to my disability, such as being able to have frequent breaks? Are you allowed to do that after the fact?
Yes, and
Okay.
disability is also very dynamic. Think of how many people who say no and acquire a disability later and then go to HR.
Yes. Okay.
So it's valid. And you also have to remember that employers that ask that question aren't really doing so to suss out who has a disability and who doesn't, even though it feels that way. That not everybody can actually ask that. Typically, who asks that are folks who have contracts or subcontractors or whatever, or receiving federal funding or something with the government that they have to meet these types of standards to ideally hire a certain amount of people with disabilities, that it's really a demographic question more than anything else.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it doesn't always get used as such.
I want to be a neurodiverse workplace. I see that as a strength in a lot of ways. And I also want to make sure that we are treating our employees with the same
Mhm,
respect that we would treat any of our clients. So if they need an accommodation, I want to go out of my way to make sure that they get that accommodation so that they feel
mhm.
comfortable and they stay with us and they want to
Yeah.
work with us. I see the strengths that come with hiring someone that's neurodiverse.
I think there are ways to do that that isn't necessarily asking a question that can be construed as an issue. And accommodations are also something that benefits all sorts of different people, not just always people with disabilities. I think a
Yes.
lot about working parents
Yes. Very
and
much
people who
so.
just have all sorts of other things going on in their lives. We accommodate people who might not have reliable transportation. We accommodate working parents who have to stay home with their kids and work remote or pick up a kid from school. We're really good at that stuff. Why aren't we as good at disability? So I look at accommodations as this it's a human thing, and sometimes it's a lack of empathy from the neurotypicals or the
Yeah.
non-disabled folks in the room.
What is something that you feel like you've really struggled with on your career journey or personal endeavors that you've had to overcome?
That is honestly probably the biggest thing the more that I think about it is other people's preconceptions of who I am and what I'm capable of just on the word autism alone.
Yeah.
Is that people assume what you're good at, they assume what you're bad at, and they automatically will write you off or they will assume that you're a positive stereotype like you're great at computers.
Yeah.
Also, there's people who I will encounter at networking events, especially. This is probably the weirdest thing that happens to me. They will come up to me knowing my story and just talk about how brave I am or how proud they are of me. Like most people at networking events, I want to meet people, I want to connect, I want to talk about my career,
Mhm.
and I don't get that same luxury of just getting to say, "Oh, once upon a time, I practiced in healthcare litigation, and now I do something else."
Yeah.
I wish people would ask me boring questions. I know that sounds so silly, but it's something I don't get to experience every time. I'd rather get the boring stuff than, "Oh my gosh, you're so brave for being so honest with your story. We read about you in the news," or whatever, and you're like, "Can you just ask me about my career like you did the next person and the person you're gonna talk to after me?"
People almost infantilize you. Well, this is one of my biggest gripes is a lot of people automatically think if someone has autism that they also have an intellectual disability.
Mhm.
And so they talk to you on like they drop
Oh
it down to like a 3rd grade level.
oh my
And
gosh, you're
it's
so
like, "Whoa."
sweet.
Yeah, and it's like baby talk. I've
Yep.
stopped telling ER doctors that my kids have autism.
I don't blame you. Medical settings are the one place that I usually am the least likely to disclose.
Yep. Yeah. It has afforded really good conversation for me and my daughter. We had one ER doc. I said, "And she has autism." And he immediately was like, "Aw, so, where is she complaining of the pain?" And I looked at him and I'm like,
Because they don't talk to you like you're a person. You're
yeah.
like, ask her."
Yeah, that's exactly what I said. I looked at him and I'm like, "No, you can ask her. She can tell you where the pain is." And so
Mhm,
my daughter was like, right here." And no, he kinda continued the baby talk with her. And as soon as he walked out and closed the curtain, she looked at me and she goes, "Mommy, why is he talking to me like I'm an idiot?" I
mhm,
was like, "Oh, honey, okay, this is a great opportunity to talk about sympathy versus empathy." And I've always tried to preach to them, like, you're gonna come across ignorant people in your life. It's as
mhm.
long as it's not malicious, you get to choose how you interpret that. If you choose to interpret it of this is awful, why do they do this, and this is horrible, I promise you, your entire life, you will have a negative outlook on everyone that talks to you because you will come across this all the time, especially
It's
with
tough.
autism.
It's tough.
Yeah, last
I
thing
agree.
is if you can give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think I would tell my younger self to stick with the things you love. Don't be afraid. Because so often I think I had all these hobbies and I would try to do the more socially acceptable thing at the same time and try to stifle the thing I cared about the most. I wish that I just accepted more of my passions instead of being like, "Oh, I need to do them on my own time." And I feel like being an adult is just sometimes being an oversized kid because 'cause you're like, "Oh my gosh, I can indulge my passions when I want to now." So have more fun and just, like, be yourself and you will find your people.
Yes, absolutely. I love that, Haley. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I think my
Thank you for
listeners, I
having
know my
me.
kids are going to get so much out of this just listening to you speak, and you are inspirational to the autistic community because you're not afraid to talk about it. So thank
Thank
you.
thank you as well.
I hope our listeners out there got as much out of this as I did. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. And for all of our listeners out there, thank you for listening and go out and conquer your day.